Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. My premise, the assumption from which I start is that even though they are technologically obsolete, monospaced fonts are still in some use. And thankfully, Paolo Coluzzi's slides demonstrated that. So I think that's a very nice starting point. I'm intentionally not including the instances where monospaced fonts have a specific motivated context or use, such as representing typewritten letters. But when I started getting interested in this topic, I began noticing more and more uses of monospaced fonts in the linguistic landscape and done by typographic laypeople, presumably. So I asked myself two questions: why this choice, and how legible are they? I think the legibility of monospaced fonts is it's like the elephant in the room, but I'm also interested in having a slight idea of who and how or why people choose this class of font. And the way I approach this is with mainly psycholinguistic methods, that is in the talk today, with a rating study and an eye tracking study. And the note on the results I'm going to present, they are all verified using inference statistics. So I'm just going to present the results, but there are statistics behind that. I'm first going to go into the aesthetics part, the rating study, to get an idea if people enjoy using monospaced fonts, if that's the reason they choose it. Then we're going to move on to the eye tracking study, which is going to have results at different levels of granularity. And finally, some conclusions I draw from all this. The aesthetics of monospaced fonts. I conducted a rating study in 2017 and 2019 using 9 font families. Because they included both a monospaced variant and a proportional variant. And they were presented using a constant pangram as the text. So they are real typeface samples. They don't have linguistic content. There were just the two conditions. The typefaces were presented in the proportional variant and also in the monospaced variant. And there were 67 participants in this rating study, none of whom had any idea what this was about or that I'm interested in monospaced fonts. And they were also not particular users of monospaced fonts. They were not, for example, software engineers who work daily with code. One of the tasks in this rating study was perfectly straightforward. Look at this font sample and rate it on a 6-point Likert scale. Of course, it was conducted in German, so very unbeautiful is something that can be said in German. I just wanted to translate it straightforwardly because it was symmetric to very beautiful, the other end of the scale. So what we see here is that the rating is quite close to balanced for the proportional fonts at the top of the diagram. It's relatively close to 50-50%, with a slight positive bias, but that's quite small. And it has a very noticeable shift to the negative end of the spectrum for monospaced fonts. That is 72% of the responses said this monospaced font does not look beautiful. in addition to this overt task where people were aware of what they're doing, of what they're being asked, I also did a more covert association task where the subjects were presented with a pool of 12 adjectives, and they were instructed to pick one adjective out of this pool which fits with the typeface. The task instruction was quite generic on purpose. The design behind it is that 6 of the adjectives are positively connotated adjectives and 6 of them are negatively connotated. So what I'm actually measuring is if they have a more positive or more negative association. And in this diagram, as before, it's quite relatively close to balanced for the proportional fonts. No particular opinion on proportional fonts, sort of. And it again has that shift to the negative end of the spectrum for monospaced fonts, which is in a similar range to the overt elicitation. So we see a quite clear preference for proportional fonts from typographical lay people who were not aware of what precisely they were being tested for. The overt and the covert task are in close agreement. And this is already a bit of an interpretation. I consider the effect size which we just saw with 72% rating monospaced fonts as not beautiful, a not inconsiderable effect size. So to put it plainly, they didn't like the monospaced fonts. If they have that intuitive, aesthetic preconception of the fonts, does that translate to their reading behavior? Is it tied together? Is the legibility or perhaps also the motivation to read connected with that? That's where we get into the eye tracking experiment, which looks into that. First, at this point, I'd like to take a small, short survey of findings so far on legibility of monospaced fonts. Peterson and Tinker, the classic researchers, found a slower text reading speed with monospaced fonts. Rainer and colleagues recently found a constant sentence reading rate. So with single sentences, there was no difference. And the results of Mansfield and colleagues are a bit more complicated, a bit too much for a single slide. There are interactions with font size and visual acuity of readers. So in short, I'd abbreviate, it's complicated. At the same time, while we see in the extant research that monospace does not necessarily, according to some research, directly compare to proportional fonts, it's still the basis, the typographic material used in a lot of empirical eye tracking research, as pointed out by these people. So that's good occasion to do an eye tracking study with which directly compares proportional to monospaced fonts. For this study, I used 112 single sentences, which were presented on the screen in a single line. The experiment was in 4 conditions. Again, I had proportional and monospaced fonts, and to include a little bit of the natural variation of typefaces out there, I had Lucida and Computer Modern Unicode. Of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg, but yeah, maybe that's for the question and answer session. And There were 64 participants, again, naive. They didn't know what the purpose was. They just came into a room, read stuff, and didn't know I was looking for monospaced fonts. I analyzed these results. As I said, I had whole sentences at different levels, which means different parts or different aspects of the stimulus materials. And the first I'm going to look at here is the whole sentence from start to finish. And a very simple result is there is no change in total reading time. That is from the beginning of the sentence to the end of the sentence, pictured here in this diagram. You can see the model estimates are perfectly identical. And I also have a rather tentative result. I also included comprehension questions in the experiment. I may have a ceiling effect in there because everyone was essentially always right in the questions. But obviously, I didn't manage to produce any comprehension problems. So in this data set, monospaced fonts are perfectly comprehensible. At the same time, embedded in the sentence material was a target word. So each sentence had one word at a more or less fixed position, which was controlled for linguistic variables. So that's a word which can be analyzed as well without including too much noise from linguistic variation. And of course, I looked at that as well. And one of the findings there, which is the one in the diagram here, is that the first fixation duration, that is the first time the readers fixated on the word and started processing the word, is shorter for monospaced fonts. That would essentially translate to quicker reading. The first pass time, which equals to the first time the word is read in its entirety, is also shorter slightly. So these two would agree, essentially. So far, at the global level, we don't see any effect. At the local level, we see an effect. I start wondering what is going on. And I looked at another aspect of the reading behavior. That is more the Saccade planning, the reading strategy, essentially. Okay. Let's first look at the first bullet point, which is also the one graphed in the diagram. So this concerns the oculomotor control of the eyes, where to guide the eyes during reading the whole sentence. And one aspect I looked at based on previous research is how often people fixated on words, on letters, and when they fixated on interword spaces, where there is actually no linguistic content to take in. And surprisingly, that was a very clear result. For the monospaced fonts, a lot more fixations landed on the spaces between the words. And one may wonder if that is a very efficient processing, looking at blank space. There's a lot going on in Saccade planning. There are also more fixations on the whole sentence. The fixations are shorter. And finally, the bullet point which showed up too early, the saccades, the jumps through the sentence span fewer letters, but are longer when measured in pixels. That was a lot. So here's a summary. There's an adaptation of reading strategy when shifting from proportional fonts to monospaced fonts. it compensates the difference between the two classes of typefaces entirely in the global measures as the total reading time. And I'd say this adaptation is very efficient because it's effective, it reaches its goal, it happens very quickly, and it's not overly fussy. So we get fixations on the interword spaces, which might be quite useless, but they don't really matter in the big picture. I'm still wondering a bit about if there are cumulative effects, if people read pages and pages of monospaced fonts. That's at present for me an unresolved question. Taking all this together, my conclusions are for the aesthetic area, there's a clear and relatively strong preference for proportional typefaces. And there's an agreement between the two types of task I did. So that's a very clear result. In the reading behavior, in the eye tracking study, we found this highly efficient adaptation to monospaced typefaces. But also, there's this disjunct between the global reading behavior and the local measures and the reading strategy. So in this regard, these two approaches don't quite agree, in my opinion. A few interpretations of this. Reading behavior is multi-level and gradated. It's not quite easy to boil down empirical findings to a binary categorization of legible or not legible, or even a simple gradation from very legible to not so legible. I think future operationalizations of legibility need to account for this. Currently, I see something to be done about this. For example, Lonsdale formulates legibility quite simply as speed and accuracy. So in my data, speed and accuracy are completely unaffected. There would be nothing which concerns the definition of legibility, which Lonsdale has put forward. But I'd argue one also has to take into account that a adaptation of reading strategy had to take place. And my final point, the intuitive rating results, which had this very clear preference for proportional typefaces, are not mirrored in the more qualitative reading behavior results. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a remark. So the psycholinguistic part was very interesting, but when you talk about monospaced fonts, you are not confusing monospaced with slab serif, with Egyptian, because most monospaced used today are slab serif. Mm-hmm. Have you also taken non-slab serif monospaced fonts, which are very rare, but you can make them for your study?
Yeah. That's something I had in mind for the eye tracking study. That's essentially why I included Lucida. The version of Lucida which I had was monospaced sans serif.
Okay.
So I don't recall the official names, Lucida Sans Unicode or something, and Lucida Typewriter, I believe.
And when you say computer modern Unicode, you mean computer modern Roman or typewriter?
Exactly, both versions. The one the one variant with slab serifs. So that was the idea behind this. I have one sans serif version. I think one typeface which is in some spread is the terminal typeface used in Mac OS, which is a sans serif monospaced. I think at one point it was Andale and replaced at one point. That's one reason why I wanted a sans serif monospaced in the experiment. And of course, a lot of the typewriter style is this slab serif style, and that's covered by computer modern Unicode.
Okay. Any question? Yes.
Hey, very interesting eye tracking data results. I'm curious. I know that a lot of times in eye tracking, you will also look at skip rate of how many words are actually skimmed over. So it was interesting that there was more fixations, but much shorter fixations. So would you interpret that as like a form of almost skipping? Or I guess how did skipping look in the data if you collect?
I don't think there's skipping in this data, or probably not to any relevant extent. The information I have is there are more fixations, and they are partly accounted for by the fixations on the interword spaces. So you make a fixation on the space, and then you have to refixate on the word, which is a wasteful process for the motor system, for the motor control, I believe. So yeah, and also these fixations on the interword spaces are relatively short. I think they impact on this mean fixation duration.
Thank you. Sorry, one more question. I was wondering, I think in your literature review, you mentioned that a different study had some kind of conflicting results. Was there something particularly about this study and that study and your study that maybe accounts for that? Or do you have any hypotheses on why the results were different on the reading rate?
I don't think so. It's this Mansfield and colleagues. It's relatively specific. It's interested in loss of vision acuity and the font sizes you need to compensate them. I have not noticed any way of connecting that to my own research.
I thought in terms of horizontal dimension, could it be possible that interword spaces in the monospace were larger than interword spaces in the Roman one?
Yes. Yes, I did not change the interword spaces of the fonts as they are. So they are the full letter width of that particular font, which is way above a normal space.
Okay. Thanks also from my side for the presentation, this overview. Monospaced fonts are not, of course, much used in publishing in general, but they do have, and you mentioned the code as one example, definitely their niche usage where they're perfectly common. So have you, or do you plan to do a similar study where you would involve people like readers of IT literature who would be more accustomed to see monospaced fonts on an everyday basis, also to look at the preference, to account for a possible preference just because people are very much used to seeing a certain type of font rather than monospaced fonts?
Yes, that would be, I think, a quite fruitful approach to take into account prior experience and of the participants, to have like some expert group. Although I would also think this data already demonstrated that lay people who have no specific connection to monospaced fonts were already also able to adapt quite quickly. But yeah, also for the rating, it would be interesting to include regular users of monospaced fonts, for example, or what could also potentially be interesting is to do such a survey, or maybe also on other typographic aspects among type professionals, and contrast between lay people and professionals or other people who are work daily with these matters.
And then you can test with Japanese people, since in Japan, monospaced fonts are officially the standard, or Latin script, Romaji. Okay, any other question? No, but thank you very much.
My pleasure.